At the end of every NHL season is another one. A 4-round, each a best-of-7 gauntlet that dares one team to fight through it all to hoist the Stanley Cup. Far and away the most difficult 16 to 28 game stretch of hockey to play, and by far the most fun to watch. The intensity shoots up to 101 because every goal or mistake means you can be that much closer to glory or sudden death. The conference champions squaring off in the final is generally considered to be the pinnacle of playoff hockey, but some conference finals give them a run for their money. This is the Legend Factory, where the greatest stories are made and household tales of glory are forged. They're just also so darn fun to watch, but how can we rank them? Which is the best Stanley Cup finals in the last decade and a half, in which in that time there has been no lack of great stories? To answer this question, we must ask two more. Firstly, when people think of a great Stanley Cup playoff series, what are the largest factors considered? Two, when people watch a playoff series, or hockey in general, what about the game makes it the most exciting? The answers to these questions will become our measuring sticks. Usually the answer to the first question is series length. At least on paper, a longer series not only means more hockey to watch, but also vaguely indicates an evenness of the series. But nostalgia also has a way of creeping into this discussion, so I've included a matchup/story statistic, which is an arbitrary number from 1 to 5 based on how hyped the series was, or how storybook, etc. But as we'll see, this weight will be relatively small. The second question could have a host of different answers, which is good because there's a slew of well-defined statistics that correlate with them. The general consensus seems to be that the most engaging hockey is fast-moving and scoring-chancy, but not totally one-sided. There's a statistical theme implicit in these responses, which are listed here. I'll explain them. Scoring chances, which obviously takes care of the fast-moving and scoring-chancy bits, implied how often there was a good opportunity to score. The more there are over the course of a game, the more excitement. Expected goals for percentage, or a similar stat, is one that looks at how one-sided a game is played. You figure how many goals would have been scored by either team when looking at the quality and volume of scoring chances compared to the average goals scored from those same chances across the whole season, divvied up by which team had those chances into a percentage. So if two teams had a combined 5 expected goals in the game, and one team owned 2.75 of those expected goals, that would mean their expected goals for the game would be a healthy 55%, with the other team obviously having a 45%. A 5% difference from 50% is the short end of the stick, but not atrocious. Once it gets towards 60-40, that's when the word dominating gets thrown around. Adding a little spice to the equation, we should consider goals, lead changes, and the scoreboard. I'll get to these in a second. Now, to figure out the order in which these metrics should be weighted or calculated, we have to consider both the micro and the macro, bringing us back to that very first question. My experience has led me to the conclusion that while the first thing people remember about a series is its length, that's really the only macro stat that takes precedence. Otherwise, events that occur while actually watching the games, such as scoring chances, lead changes, goals, those take precedence. And the order among those is decided by which of them best fit this statement. So the order of calculations will go something like this, with decreasingly impactful weights. You'll notice this statistic, expected goals for percentage difference cumulative. You get this stat if you stack every expected goals for from both teams in the entire series and put them next to each other. It essentially shows how much each team showed up total in the finals. Each series starts off with a base score of 100 because it's 100. Since longer series are generally considered to be exponentially better, their score increases exponentially the more games there were. With this formula, we get 4 different results. A 4-game sweep would stay at 100, 5 games gets 104, 6 games gets 116. Since Game 7s are the thing for a playoff series, they get a whopping 164. Scoring chances per game. The value comes from the number of scoring chances per minute. The scoring chances modifier is added, not multiplied to the prior value. This way, a 7-game series with only 0.8 scoring chances per minute would get a total value of 224, and a 5-game series with a monster 1.2 per minute would get a 194, slightly evening out the playing field due to the 5-game series just having way more oomph to it, but still giving an advantage to the 7-gamer. Now getting into the multiplication. The expected goals for percentage differential on average is a massive modifier. A series where the average difference in expected goals for was 10%, a greatly lopsided 60-40 split on average, would drop to 60% of its prior value. However, an average of 2.5%, implying lots of closely contested games, would only drop to around 86%. A perfectly evenly played series in every game would stay at 100%. As mentioned, little of it will matter if people know the game's nearly out of reach, if not over completely. A 2-goal difference only takes off a little, but a 3-goal difference takes off twice as much. One series had about 4 games where there were huge stretches of goal differentials. Conversely, another series never had a goal differential greater than 1 until the final 2 minutes of the series. The modifiers for each respectively are a drop to 61% and 97%. What a difference garbage time makes. This is the lead changes per game formula and the goals per game formula. The matchup and story just adds 1% for every point. At the very end, I will prorate all scores so that the highest score is 100 because it's 100. Here's how the modifiers stack up. One final note, for comparison and reference's sake, I will also calculate and rank every individual game, but with slightly altered weights. Mainly, every game gets a modifier of +5 as it gets longer, balancing both tension of potential elimination games and the merit of what is actually playing out. The expected goals for percentage cumulative adjustment will be nullified since obviously now we're only measuring a single game, and scoring chances get a 33% higher weight, going up from 75 to 100. So that's the boring stuff out of the way. I think I made it as fair as I could without making any one stat completely busted. Maybe the end result is obscene to you, maybe it's exactly what you'd expect. Either way, thanks for sticking around. So, without further ado, here's the graph demonstrating it all by year, with some modifiers for context, scores without the length bonus, the expected goals for weight, and the score penalty differential. For example, you can see how no length bonus generally handicaps 7 gamers, while modestly improving the chances of 5 gamers. A bit more complicated, losing the expected goals for percentage modifier forgives series that were lopsided to watch if they at least had a close score usually or went the distance. Removing the score differential penalty will reward series that were at least long and hard fought even if the score wasn't close, that kind of thing. Remember, these lowered scores don't signify that without whichever modifier it's a better or worse series, just better or worse series compared to the others with that same caveat. So, who gets the short end of the equation stick? It was a defending champion against a team that, if the playoff structure were any different, would not have made it to the finals in the first place. The 1-4 seeding divisional format guaranteed that a Canadian team would make the conference finals in 2021. And of course, the bottom seed went all the way. Well, almost. See, if you take away the expected goals for percentage modifier, this series becomes a bit more respectable. But it still barely gets out of the basement. That's because the expected goals for was dominated by the Lightning, in a surprise to no one. It had the highest average differential at nearly 12%. That's 62 to 38% on average. The Canadians stood no chance. And it's not even like there was parity within that range. Game 5 was the only one not completely dominated by the Lightning, and even that was the lowest event game of the series. Combine that with one of the lower scoring chance totals of all the series, as well as no lead changes in a lopsided Game 1 and 3. This one was pretty uneventful. At least we got an overtime goal. One of the few finals I watched every game of live, and it seemed a lot more interesting then than people generally remember it now. Smashville brought all their hype to stop the Pittsburgh train, but that was basically all this series had going for it. Despite being a 6-game series, it had the lowest scoring chance average of all of them, and couldn't get above water in any other category. If a game was evenly contested, like games 3, 4, and 5, it would be ruined by the score being a bajillion to nothing at the end of the first. If the score was actually close, like in Game 2, then it would be ruined by Pittsburgh never letting Nashville have the puck. That is, if both weren't lopsided like in Game 1. Game 6 was pretty good, though. It cracked the top 20. So that's something. Game 6 existing alone saves this series from being last place, blowing on the relative ranking to just a pixel above 2021. And it always falls around the same relative spot with or without all these modifiers, so, according to this calculator at least, it can be classified as definitively unexciting. the Old Guard Hall of Fame primed Red Wings against Sid the Kid's up-and-coming Penguins. Looking at the results, I'm surprised it was this low, until I realized how much the Red Wings walked all over the Penguins in this series. The Red Wings on average owned just over 60% of the expected goals. If expected goals for were not considered, 2008 would be almost middle of the pack, but Mike Babcock's Red Wings ran roughshod over the Penguins, who put up about as good of a fight as you could expect of them. The model has games 3 and 4 pegged as pretty darn good, but games 1, 2, and 6 are all sunk by pretty substantial score and play differentials. Game 5 disappointingly also does not score as high despite having a triple OT worthy 97 scoring chances, because it was also the game in which the Red Wings were their Red Wingest. At least we got an overtime goal. Yeah, 2012. They named a whole year after Roland Emmerich's 4th best film. This may not be the worst series statistically, but when I hear people talk about which series they just wanted to end, it's always 2012. Here's a statistic that could help you preview that sentiment. In this entire 6-game series, there was not one lead change. Not one. It was off to a good start for the Cupless Kings and spectators in general. 2 overtime games that were moderately close, if low scoring. But then the Kings outmuscled the Devils in Game 3 to take a 3-0 series lead. It was over at that point. The Devils fought tooth and nail to stave off elimination in Games 4 and stole Game 5 before the Kings absolutely dunked on them in Game 6. Now 4 of those 6 games don't sound bad at all, but they had below average balance of play, a very low scoring chances rate, and second fewest goals per game, and no lead changes. And Game 6 was such a complete and utter pounding, the worst scored cup-clinching game on this list. It is also 2 spots away from being the very worst of all of them. For a series that had 4 of its 6 games be close in one way or another, nothing much happened. It was literally a slightly closer 2008. At least we got some overtime goals. It was supposed to be a must-watch, a titanic bout of heavyweights, the young gunning electric offense of the Avalanche versus the steady, methodical, and reigning 2-time champion Lightning. Instead, we got a very bipolar product, which is kind of a running theme for a lot of series. I'll walk you through each game here since each of them are probably pretty fresh in your minds. The Avalanche dominated Game 1, though it was close on the scoreboard the whole way. The Avalanche dominated Game 2, and it was never close on the scoreboard. Nobody dominated Game 3, but it was never close on the scoreboard. Nobody dominated Game 4, and it was close on the scoreboard. Game 5 was a lower event version of Game 4, before the one-sided, but still decently exciting 2-1 event that was Game 6. The series had the highest average scoring chances per game, true to its marquee hype, and we got 2 very, very good games in 4 and 5. The rest of the series ranged from lucky to be close to outright stomping. Those 2 games saved the series from being a complete disaster. But nonetheless, it was exciting. We hadn't seen a team as young and fast as Colorado playing for it all in a long while, and they brought a great name to their style of play, taking advantage of an older, more worn-down team. For one of the only times watching a finals I wasn't particularly invested in, I still really felt like the Avalanche were a team. Also, Erik Johnson is a baller. This series was statistically very similar to LA New Jersey, and it gets the leg up because of its scoring chances and excitement surrounding it. In the end, though, that can only count for so much. At least we got some overtime goals. God, we're only 5 series in, and the Penguins have already been in 3 of them. Shoot me. While the placement of the series might raise some eyebrows, it did for me. Keep in mind that it is a full 9 points ahead of the prior series, the largest leap between series in this ranking, and it is not a dud of a series by any means. On the contrary, you can take all sorts of things from this series. The good is that score differential-wise, this series was second closest out of all 15. The bad is, the Penguins largely controlled play in this series. And the meh is that over 6 games, the action was alright. Of note, it's that it's the lowest series with a game in the top 10. Game 3 cracks the 8th spot. And for Sharks fans, it has to be one of the franchise's most treasured outings ever. No team ever led by more than 1, it was the tightest game of the series, and there was exactly 1 lead change.
Donskoy goes around behind and a shot!
Game 2 was a lower event version of Game 3, but no other games really left the outcome in doubt except on the scoreboard, which didn't have too many goals on it anyway. But there is something to be said about the scoreboard always being close, despite how dominant the winning teams usually were. The Penguins and Sharks in the 2016 playoffs were the definition of opportunistic. All it took was one rush up ice to tie the game, even if you'd been kicking them in the teeth. And I think the paradox of the lopsided play metrics versus the closeness of the score exemplifies that to a T. After all, if the game-to-game play imbalance was ignored, 2016 would be the 5th best series of them all. One of only 3 5-game series on this list, this is probably the most unfairly derided one. Like its kingly predecessor in 2012, the 2014 series is one people seem to have kind of poo-pooed because, oh, it's the Kings in another walk of a series again. There's a lot more to it. For one, it was among the highest event series of all of them, in no small part due to the 5 periods of overtime we witnessed, all of which went the Kings' way, of course. We may not have got many games out of this series, but we got a lot of sudden death madness. On a similarly positive note, the score was generally close for almost all of this short series, with the only 3-goal deficit coming at the end of Game 3, which brings me to what really hurts this series' overall score. Games 3 and 5 were all Kings. Game 2 towed that line as well. In a 5-game series, that equates to about 40% being dominated by LA. And it's pretty disappointing for fans of this series. If either of these factors were left out in calculations, the series would be regarded as a top 5er. But we never got a Game 6, and some of the games we did get were just a little too one-sided. Alternatively, if one of the great aspects of this series that we did get, like the overtimes or close scores, was changed, then this series gets nowhere close to where it is. The 2014 Kings-Rangers series gets the Azita Zaida Award for most volatile series. One extra tweak to any existing statistic could make it a classic or a bust. So let's leave it where it is, as it's best to. As an enigma in finals history. The 2020 playoffs have a big fat asterisk next to them for obvious reasons. The playoff format was beyond borked, players weren't at all at their customary end-of-season form, and they were playing while in quarantine. But that didn't stop the Stars and Bolts from putting on a pretty good show. Let's start with the not-so-good. This series has a very obvious kryptonite. The scoring really got stuck in the mud. There was a pretty substantial amount of time with a multi-goal lead in games 1, 2, 3, and 6, and they never let that gap close. It's pretty easy to recognize that some parts of these games were played with an expected winner. On the other hand, games 4 and 5 were pretty damn good in their own right. And across most of the board, the expected goals for in this series was the third closest game by game, which makes the score imbalance that much more of a shame. To twist the knife a little, the average expected goals for difference would have been top tier were it not for games 4 and 5, which had the highest differences. That's really just rotten luck. So all of that may have sounded like a hodgepodge of conflicting standpoints and statistics, and you'd be right. But here's the cool thing. All of those stats even out completely. Look at this spread. No matter which way you slice it, take away length bonus, take away the score penalty, ignore whatever play imbalance, among its peers, this series always falls in the exact same spot. No other series even comes close to how definitively decent the 2020 finals was from every angle. It's ironic that in a time of the greatest uncertainty of this young century, that series could easily be considered the most reliable of them all. And it's not calculated here, but this was the least viewed final. And understandably, a lot of people had their emotional investment elsewhere, so not that many people saw it. If you have the time, maybe give this series a watch. I think you'll find it's aged pretty well. Watching these players play their guts out with not a single fan in the seats, and with the seemingly entire rest of the world standing quiet, and knowing that it was the end of an era as longtime broadcaster Doc Emrick was calling his final series, it will feel really funereal, surreal, sepulchral, but not joyless. Despite what goes on in the so-called real world, I don't think hockey could ever be joyless. All in all, though, it's a series that was born into hard luck, but nonetheless delivered the most well-rounded series of the last 15 years. That's worth a lot in my book. This series. This is the series that makes me frustrated that people generally care most about the length of a series when discussing how good or bad it was. When this series ended, pundits called it an instant classic, with many saying it was a 7-game slugfest that returned to the big, bruising kind of hockey that the Western Conference teams had dominated in the late 90s. Or something. I didn't really see it then, and I don't see it now. Yes, it was a 7-game series. Yes, there was a pretty good story. Yes, it had pretty good offense and an OT, but most other stats really dropped the ball. Certainly at least below instant classic level. For starters, 3 of the 7 games had expected goal differentials of over 15%. Weirdly, these were the games where the score was somehow pretty close. When the scores weren't close, they stayed that way. 3 of the 4 games were over halfway through. Ignoring the imbalance of play, though, puts this series at number 1. Believe it or not, I don't know how that happened. Theoretically, that means it's the best looking series on paper, but I don't see that either. I guess having 5 forgettable games can be offset by going the distance, since Game 7 is the ultimate boon, apparently, when considering how great a series is, even if the actual Game 7 sucks. It's also not the only Bruins series on this list for which one specific weight greatly affects the series ranking. But more on that later. Comparing the scores of the 7th place 2019 with the 9th place 2014, their series rankings honestly should be switched. 2014 slots in at 7, 23, 82, 12, and 51. Meanwhile, 2019 occupies spots 83, 37, 81, 63, 61, 27, and 55. Their average scores compared to each other is still in 2014's favor at 129.8 to 92.5. It doesn't seem right that the latter is regarded as the better series, but that's just what happens when there ends up being more hockey played, whether people like myself like it or not. Speaking of things I like, the third and best of the 5-game series on this list. With how even the teams played at the end of the day, it is a crime it didn't go 7. It was the old guard who had never won versus the young misfits who only knew victory. Being a Capitals fan, obviously I was pretty invested in the statistics of this series, and it doesn't really disappoint anywhere. It was a well-rounded series. Every category of it ranges from above average to great, and even the cumulative effort from both teams was statistically dead even. It was just a game or two too short. Proving the point, removing the length bonus puts it in the top 3, but without the score differential penalty and the expected goals modifier, it doesn't really move in either direction. Looking at the individual games reveals a lot about these averages. Out of the 90 finals games since 2008, the Vegas-Washington series has not one but 2 games in the top 10. Game 5 is in 6th place, and Game 1 is the second best out of all of them. Game 5 had a killer combo of always being a 1-goal game and pretty even expected goals for percentage. Combine that with the series trademark above average in every other category, and bang, you're 6th place. But Game 1? Oh boy. Game 1 had the exact same neck-and-neck score and level play, but then got absolutely juiced with a finals record 4 lead changes and a series high 10 goals. That one game had more lead changes than the prior 2 finals had in their entire series combined. Definitely one of the best finals openers of all time. In the top 10, only Hawks Flyers has more than one game, but both of these went into overtime, so the scoring chances modifier gives them a little extra mustard. The fact that 2 of a 5-game series games are ranked in the top 6, especially with one of them being a Game 1, is something special. But the final score rates this series only as pretty good, so let's bring down those averages. It's not Game 2, which was a pretty good game, one that Vegas probably should have won. It's not Game 3, which was slightly less good since the Caps controlled most of the play. It was Game 4. First period 2-0 and 3-0 leads really put a blemish on the otherwise squeaky clean goal differential metric, which is a shame because the expected goals for percentage was far more even than the prior 2 games, despite the Caps running away with the goals. But like I said, if the game's out of reach, it can't be that exciting. Man, if James Neal hit that empty net in the first period, who knows how this game or series turns out. So watch Game 4 if you want to laugh. Games 2 and 3 if you're a fan of either team. and games 1 and 5 if you want some all-timers. Two words: glorious bloodshed. By far the nastiest series on the list. It had headshots, finger biting, taunting, suspensions, trash talking, Vancouver, and Boston. It was so nasty that even the statistics know it. Removing the score penalty and only focusing on how long and hard fought it was rockets it up to first place with no other series even coming close. In fact, that score is so high, 211.1, it single-handedly puts every other series underwater by comparison. The score penalty held back a monster series. I mean, look at all that red. The only series that comes close is 2017, and that was the second lowest ranked series. The 2019 Boston series had closer scores, but finished 2 spots lower because that's how important close play is to this model. So let's break this monstrosity down. Game 1 was a scoreless tie, despite 70 scoring chances, until noted dirty player Raffi Torres scored the game's only goal with under 20 seconds left. Game 2 didn't have as many chances, but made up for it by having a lead change, no leads greater than 1, and going into overtime, where it was promptly ended 11 seconds in by noted dirty player Alex Burrows. Let's skip ahead a little. Game 5 was basically a repeat of Game 1, but with a slightly earlier goal. And darn it, all of these games were within 4% expected goals for. Games 1, 2, and 5 are all breathing down the neck of the top 10. And the even play for the most part continued in the games we conveniently skipped over. Every single game was closely played, far more than any other series. So, what's the problem? Let's return to the score. Boston outscored Vancouver 21-4 in their 4 wins. The score was never close for any of them at any point. Credit to the Canucks, they still played even with the Bees despite having no hope of winning, but when the game is 4-0 after 2, 3-0 after 2, 4-0 after 1, and 3-0 after 2 again, that's going to render about half the series, and the Canucks' effort, pointless. After all, Game 7 is 62nd place, Game 4 is 73rd, Game 3 is 83rd, and poor Game 6 is the very worst game of all, creating a titanic gulf in quality of games in this series. It's a good thing these things can only go 7 games. If there was an 8th, these teams might have actually killed each other. This series had a score of 84.5. Number 4, miraculously, also had a score of 84.5. So what's making number 4 higher? Remember the tie-breaking stat? The story. 4th place had a must-see matchup that was nothing short of marquee. Two recent champions going at it on the biggest stage of all, and the series did not disappoint. The Blackhawks were 3 years removed from their 2010 championship, had won the President's Trophy in the lockout-shortened season, and had defeated the defending champion Kings in the Western Conference Finals. The Bruins, whose city had been shaken by the Boston Marathon bombing a few months earlier, were 2 years removed from their finals win, and had gotten to the finals by overcoming a 4-1 third-period deficit to the Leafs in Game 7 of the first round. Then they blew by the Penguins and the Rangers. So naturally, given how high-powered this series was, the first game went to triple overtime, good for 9 goals and 120 scoring chances, and was close the whole way. Instant classic. Game 2 went to overtime as well. Less classic, but still a very good game. Game 3 was a pretty unremarkable 2-0 outing, but Game 4 picked up right where Games 1 and 2 left off with a nail-biting 6-5 overtime. 4 games in, both recent champions tied at 2 wins. Game 5 was close-ish on the scoreboard, but it was really the Blackhawks game. What's funny is, despite the undeniable quality of Games 1, 2, and 4, it's Game 6, with the series low 41 scoring chances that somehow was the most wild. The Bruins, who hadn't trailed all game and held the better of the play, were up 2-1, less than 90 seconds to go in regulation. Chicago's pushing, and Brian Bickle goes hard to the paint to tie it at 2. Looks like we're going to another overtime. Just kidding. 17 seconds later, Dave Bolland can't be boxed out in the crease and Chicago is up 3-2 to win it all. That one lead change is probably the most infamous in Stanley Cup Finals history. 1 minute and 16 seconds away from a Game 7 that would have undoubtedly put this series in the top 3. And in 17 seconds, it was gone. One of the most surprising endings to a Stanley Cup Finals ever. But what may just be equally surprising to you, as it sure was to me, is the series that comes in at number 3. Who knew, right? With a combined lowest 43 or 44 scoring chances per game and a measly 3.8 goals per, at the very height of goaltending power in the NHL, how did this series get so high up? Well, it's kind of an enigma. It's the only series that actually performs worse compared to the others, no matter which modifier you take away. That suggests it's standing up due to success in all 3. Simply put, it was so close. There was very little separating these teams between expected goals for percentage and actual goals at any point. Check this out. At no point in this series did a team lead by more than 1 goal, save for once, the final quarter of the 3rd period in its final game. Those lowly 3.8 goals per game, well, they were more likely to be lead-changing goals than in any other series, so that's something. Looking at the single game breakdown, most of these games fall really close together around the 20 to 40 rank, which is pretty darn good real estate, and is given an extra boost by a classic Game 3. So I guess that's enough for a 3rd place in the final ranking. But remember what I said all those years ago? It's because this series seems to not be brought up in discussion as among the best in recent history, and yet here it is, 3rd place. Why not? Why don't people talk about it? Because it's the Blackhawks. Since they won their 3rd cup in 6 years here, for many, this year was a write-off due to the so-called Blackhawks fatigue. It had a story score of 2, and even that 1 extra point was because of the Lightning. They were the young and up-and-coming team looking to dethrone a dynasty. Maybe that makes a bit more sense, considering how 4 of the 6 games in this series are a glut of pretty good but not exceptional games. This series may have actually been more memorable to the mind if it was more like the 2011 series, with a few classics and a few downright annihilations. To be quite honest, if I had an override power, I would switch this series with Chicago-Boston in 2013, but I must abide by the machine. You have to keep in mind that the calculator looks at the series as a whole, so my explanation for its placement here is that the sum of its parts are greater than the whole. Out of all these series thus far, only Vegas-Washington had a story score of 5. Chicago-Tampa had a score of 2, but what comes in at 2nd place maxes out that metric, and then some. It is, quite simply, the best Stanley Cup Finals rematch of all time. The last finals of the 2000s, a decade which had seen so much turmoil and change occur in the league, ended on as good of a note as anybody could hope for. Nothing aside from its 7-game length stand out that much in the series macros, and the individual game stats don't look that pretty either. This one is really carried by that 7-game length, far more than any other of the 7-game series. Without the bonus, it drops to 8th. But, oh well, it's what the people want. 7-game finals are the holy grail of hockey. But, the story is the key statistic that vaults it into number 2. It's a stat that's largely been neglected given how little it affects the overall score of a series. It's not surprising. But here, well, these two teams met the year before in 2008, where the Hall of Fame-riddled Red Wings trounced the Penguins. The Wings had almost exactly the same team they fielded the year before. Lidstrom, Zetterberg, Datsuk, Franzen, Osgood, Rafalski, Kronwall. They stole Hossa from the Penguins. Even old stalwarts like Draper, Maltby, Holmstrom, and Chris Chelios at 47 years young. They were stacked. They ousted the Jackets in 5, then beat the Ducks in 7 when they played dominantly enough to sweep them, and then almost did sweep the Hawks to find themselves back in the Stanley Cup final. But the Penguins showed up again at the end of the road, a little older, a little wiser, and it wasn't easy for them. They had 2 tight, hard-fought series against their arch-rivals in the Flyers and Capitals. And then, with the Red Wings in sight, they swept the Hurricanes, looking for revenge. How's that for a setup? Let's get to the games. Game 1 was a decent start to the series, with no team really running away with it, but the Wings having a manageable score and play advantage. Game 2 was a bit better. It had slightly more even play, but the exact same score, scoring chances, and time ahead by 2 goals. Eerie. Game 3 is when the series really hit its stride. Good enough to make the top 5 games of all of them. Play-wise, the game was an exact coin toss, with black and red matching each other blow for blow until Sergei Gonchar scored the Penguins' third period goal, a deficit the Red Wings would not be able to come back from with a Talbot empty netter. Game 4 was another banger, boasting a series-high 53 scoring chances as well as a tight score for basically the whole game. Game 5 was a good old-fashioned beatdown by the Red Wings, but in a series of this quality and emotion and intensity, it's absolutely forgiven. In fact, it's welcomed. Game 6 was pretty lopsided to Detroit in play, but Pittsburgh held the fort and held on for the win to force a Game 7, which was okay. It's very much a product of its time. For better or worse, it's not the same series if you don't consider the context of the bad blood simmering between these two teams on the biggest stage of all for 7 games. Really, what more is there for me or anyone else to say about this series? Probably has the latest series-defining moment coming at 59:59 of the third period of Game 7. What exactly happened there? Well, I'll let you find that out for yourself, good viewer. In opposite fashion to Chicago-Tampa in 2015, this series shows that the whole can be even greater than the sum of its parts. But even still, we have not yet reached the pinnacle. But now the summit is in sight, and with this series, we will be wanting for nothing. The first finals of the 2010s was its best. A series that had basically everything you could ask for. A great story, neck-and-neck play, a plethora of lead changes, and 7.8 goals per game average, blowing past 2018 for first place. Let's get to each. First, the story. Neither of these teams had won a cup in 35 and 49 years. Marian Hossa of the Blackhawks was in his third straight cup final with his third different team, losing in 2008 with the Penguins and 2009 with the Red Wings. Key pieces of each squad were playing against their former organizations. The obligatory at long last cup for the old men of the team. It was a lore treasure trove. Next, the play. Almost perfectly balanced. You could stand a card house on these percentages. There were 3 games with a lead change, 2 with multiple, and goals, goals, goals. Game 6 was the highest ranked individual game out of every single one. 7 goals with 2 lead changes amongst them, an evenly played game, and an overtime, all in the clinching game of the Stanley Cup Final. Game 3 is right on its heels in third place. Hi, totally bonkers Game 1 of 2018. 64 scoring chances, 1% difference in expected goals for percentage, no lead greater than 1, a lead change, and of course, overtime, not to mention 2 goal reviews. The calculator may place this one under Game 6, but Game 3 is my favorite of the 2. Games 1, 2, and 4 range from really good to alright. The lone outlier is Game 5, in which Chicago led the play, the score, and it was never really close, but you take the bad with the absurdly good. At least one team played super well in a blowout. It even looked good. The red and orange of Chicago and Philly going at it on ice, a sight to behold. Plus, Chris Pronger is the baddest motherfucker in the world.
Hossa sends it across, back to net! Everyone in the lower bowl standing. Along now, Gabriel scores! Sends up Carl, side of the net, deflection! Johnson gave it on over to Sherry. A shot, he scored! Kessler gave it on across. Defeated, but scored! Scoring! Thrown to the front and a battle for it there. It would not go! It is on back for Rafalski. Shot, he scores! Turned right back over again and led on out for someone playing. He scores! Paille! Here's Hedman, then across now for Shattenkirk at the shot. He scores! Deep slot through one.